Welcome to Virtual Sentiments. I'm your host, Kristen Collins. On today's episode, I talk to two political scientists, Dr. Amit Ran and Dr. Abraham Singer, co-authors of the recent book, Everyone's Business: What Companies Owe Society. Amit is an associate professor in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University, and he focuses on the history of political economy and democratic theory. Abe is an associate professor of management at Quinlan School of Business at Loyola University Chicago, specializing in business ethics and political theory. Everyone's Business argues that due to their economic and social influence, businesses should work to avoid wielding their power in ways that undermine fundamental democratic practices like elections, public debate, and social movements. This episode also serves as a follow-up of two episodes that we released earlier this season relating to Meta's community forums. The first episode was our season opener with Chris Rose, a governance director at Meta, and our second episode was with Dr. Alice Hsu, associate director at the Deliberative Democracy Lab at Stanford University, the third-party partner that arranges and runs deliberative projects for Meta and other clients around the world. This episode certainly stands on its own, so even if you haven't listened to those episodes, feel free to keep listening to this one. But I do highly recommend those episodes, and I think it could be very useful for you to have a good familiarity with the community forums that we talked about with Chris and Alice, because we return to these at the end of this episode as I get Amit and Abe's thoughts. I'm grateful that Abe and Amit took the time to not only chat with me, but to check out those episodes and be able to provide us with some insights based on their own work, going beyond the text that they recently published, and also drawing from recent debates in politics and business. This is also our final episode in the third season of Virtual Sentiments. But don't fret, my fabulous producer Melody and I are already working on season 4. Without further ado, I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Amit and Abe. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Kristen. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Great. Well, without further ado, maybe also I thought it'd be worth situating us a little bit from your perspectives. Feel free to kind of give also a personal view of how you got to work on this project together. And specifically for an audience who's not necessarily familiar with business ethics, what are some of the common frameworks for how people both in the scholarly community, in business communities, and the public at large think about the concept of business ethics, the different kind of frameworks that already existed, and what it means to be bringing in political theory and democracy into those conversations?
I'll start, and then Amit, you can correct me when I mess up. So it might be fair to say there's sort of two kind of big dominant approaches for thinking about business ethics, both in scholarly communities, but also in like the corporate world. One is sort of the well-known profit maximization school, often sort of whose standard bearer was Milton Friedman. And this basically, the argument of the profit maximization school is essentially to say, so one thing that's worth correcting is often when people hear that, they think it's this kind of denial of business ethics. It's just sort of like do whatever the hell you want, sort of thing, just make money, whatever. And it's a little bit more subtle than that. The profit maximization school essentially says, look, when you're at the helm of a large corporation, you take on responsibilities specific to that office or position. Namely, you have a sort of principal agent relationship with your shareholders, and you take on specific obligations and specific burdens to them. Namely, to use their resources and your office to maximize their value, maximize share value. And so it is a moral obligation, but it's a very narrow one, or a very specific one. And so that's sort of like one of the big dominant schools. The other, and so for a long time, people have often, and business ethicists specifically, have sort of taken it as their job is to either defend this or attack this, right? But in the meantime, there's actually another dominant thread that I would actually argue is the dominant approach to business ethics now, which is called the stakeholder model. And this was developed by a number of business ethicists in the 80s and 90s, specifically Ed Freeman is sort of the guy, right? Sort of Freeman. And what this argues is they say like, oh, shareholder theorists, you almost got it right, but it's not. It's yes, it's a principal agent relationship. Yes, you have fiduciary obligations, but it's not to your stockholders; it's to your stakeholders, right? You just got the vowel wrong. And so what they argue is that you're as the executive of a corporation, you have obligations not just to this one narrow group, the shareholders, but you take on obligations to all of the different parties, all of the different stakeholders, your shareholders, but also your customers, your employees, local community members, local suppliers, who help co-create corporate value. And so you have obligations to all of their interests. And this is in academically, this has sort of overtaken things, but I would argue actually in at least in at the level of discourse in corporate world, this has become an extremely dominant language. And this was sort of had its high watermark or came into its own in 2019 with the Business Roundtable statement on the purpose of the corporation, which explicitly endorses a stakeholder model. So those would be like the two big. There's some others, but those are kind of the two big behemoths, shall we say, in this space. I can situate where we are within that, but I don't know if you wanted to if there's anything I can clarify there.
No, I think that's a great summary. And I think, and so in short, would you say that to some degree, a lot of that, or I guess this would be my question, how would you view those dominant frameworks in terms of politics? Are they to some degree apolitical? Are they thinking of ethics in a more personal and social way? Or is there still some sort of implicit political theory that you see undergirding that?
I can try. So for the like profit maximization approach, um, it is like in one sense it's not political in the sense that businesses are expected to do business and not engage themselves in any other activity. But underlying it, there's a conception of politics, which we call in some academic work kind of functionally differentiated approach in which society is di- divided into different spheres. Um, Politics sets up the stage for businesses to interact with things like it's the playground, and politics is the night guard. And in this approach, um, the economic sphere is completely differentiated in the sense that they can do whatever they want under the rules of the game set up by politics. And if you have complaints about the outcomes or about what businesses do, you have to go to your legislatures and tell them change the rules. It's more complicated because there are different approaches to the role of government in this setting up the rules, but the idea is that businesses are institutionally and socially non-political. They have to do businesses, and politicians or government or the state have to set up the rules. And I think it's like the stakeholders approach is more complicated because at least in some understandings, government, society, the local place, the local communities are considered as stakeholders, and businesses are understood to have obligations to these stakeholders. So businesses have certain kind of duties of care towards the city they live, they operate in, to the and state, the nations, and so forth.
No, I think that's right. Like, I think maybe a way of putting it is to say, so in our view, I mean, we're both trained as political theorists and political scientists, and one of the things you learn as an undergrad is everything is political. So of course there's a politics to all of these things, right? And one of the ideas we get at in the book is, in a certain way, what all of these theories of business ethics are trying to do is address a certain dimension or a certain facet of corporate power, right? So, again, it's easy to do, and we're by no means Friedmanites. It's easy to sort of demonize it, but he was trying to get at a real problem, right? Which is that corporate executives were just super corrupt and were vast and were just misusing the power and the resources they had at their disposal, right? And the idea of profit maximization was a metric that was meant to discipline this misuse of power. And stakeholder theory is sort of trying to respond to the misuse of power on behalf of shareholders, right? So there is a politics here that is worth taking seriously.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Actually, I'm really glad you added that, brought that in because the other kind of context that I have in mind in talking to you guys is that in recent years, and I'm sure you guys are thinking about this too, there has been like a lot of debate. I mean, now this year there's a whole other context that we're in too, but there's been a lot of discussion around. So there were all these social movements, for example, Me Too, Black Lives Matter movement, and then there were people, and there were a lot of people in the business community and the public at large very sympathetic to those movements, and then pushing for certain changes within hiring and also just culture. Also, leading to things like, there's also a lot of controversy around Pride Month, for example, in the sense of a longtime activist being frustrated that companies would just sort of start using like rainbow colored marketing materials, things like that. And it really was this very thin kind of activism, or signaling, a sort of virtual signaling issue. But then, and so you have these critiques from the left where some of this is just sort of, to try to appeal to the tastes of the people, but it's not anything substantial. And then on the other hand, you have, I would say, more from the right or from the center of people who have a much more traditional sense of business and its relationship to politics, more like what you've described, in terms of, well, the market, competition, profit and loss, those things, discipline, that's what brings in what the businesses should be doing. And now everything is too politicized, a hand wringing over the politicization of commercial activity and kind of bringing into these social issues into these debates. And so that sort of gets us to, my question here then is then what does bringing in democracy do to this debate? I mean, does this potentially, I think I can see already that it seems to be a critique of those who would say that there is no politics in business, or the proper way of thinking about business is just no politics. But I also think those people might be a little bit overly skeptical of then bringing anything like democracy into this conversation. So, what does democracy kind of complement or not only challenge, but then also kind of maybe in some ways transcend that term of the debate of the sort of social issues on the one hand and the neutrality on the other?
I'll start, and I'll start in a slightly personal vein as well, because it might help lay these things on here. So to take a sort of step back, I've been teaching at a business school now for almost 10 years. I taught at one beforehand, and then now I've been at Loyola for a while, teaching at the Quinlan School of Business, very happily, I should say. But one thing that I sort of found, and so I'm trained as a political theorist, and so I think when I came into the business school, what I understood my job to be, and I think what the way a lot of business ethicists understand their job to be, is to sort of disabuse these sort of Gordon Gekko-like business students of their, greedy self-Friedmanite, predilections, right? And teach them that no, ethics and justice matter. And of course, I think ethics and justice do matter. But I think the thing that I've found over teaching and yeah, and previous work has really addressed like the Chicago School of Economics and the Friedman line and why it's wrong and all those things. And all that's fine. The thing that has occurred, and maybe this changed, and maybe this was always the case, is that I found almost very few of my students came in with presupposing something like the profit maximization line. Almost all of them at least understand at some level the idea that businesses have social responsibilities. The thing that they have a hard time, and I don't just mean my students, I think, and this they sort of stand for a larger impulse here, right? Is thinking that understanding what the social responsibility demands is actually pretty difficult and complex. And the reason why it's difficult and complex is because they hold power to influence larger social and political processes. And so I've found that a lot of times what I'm doing in my classroom isn't teaching students like, hey, it's more than just profit. You have to care about all these other things. It's teaching students like, hey, just because you have some idea of what virtue or morality demands doesn't mean you just get to impose that upon the world, right? That you actually have to take seriously the position you're occupying and the types of constraints that comes with, including and especially constraints regarding the way you might unduly or undemocratically wield your influence or impose your beliefs or your views upon others. And so that's, I think, where democracy, one way of thinking about where democracy really comes in and challenges these things is it says, you know, your position as a fiduciary, your position as an executive in a corporation isn't in a vacuum. It's set against a social and political context. And what you do can disrupt that social political context in ways that you have a responsibility to concern yourself with.
Amit, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm trying to relate it back to your question about the current moment and different demands from social movements. So I think part of what we are arguing is that there is no one categorical answer that can cover all cases, but it requires judgment about the particular demands and the particular ways in which they're related to democratic processes. So, take demands for DEI. The lack of diversity and equity and inclusion in the workplace may affect the quality of democracy. So, to that extent, what businesses are doing with their workforce is not just an internal matter related to how they govern themselves, but they do affect society at large, not just affect in kind of mechanical way, but affect our ability to engage in reflective engagement and thinking democratically. So making decisions in a way that takes into account the interest of everyone in an informed and equal way. So in that sense, these are like depends on the context, may be relevant and important demands for businesses to take into account.
I mean, I was just going to add, and I don't know if this takes us on a tangent, so I'll just add this here. But I mean, there is something curious about the sort of rightward response to DEI or wokeness in public, because of course the response hasn't been get politics out of companies or corporations, right? The response has actually been to enforce a certain type of politics around these things, right? Because there's like a perfectly, you know, economic-y, market-based saying, which way of approaching this, which is like, look, if having DEI or having all these statements, attracts customers in the right way, then do it. So the right wing response hasn't exactly been like get politics out. It's we want you to be political the way we think it should be political, right? And that's single gender bathrooms and all these sorts of things. And so yeah, it is interesting the way the moment kind of captures the way these two strands within the right movement of a kind of market fundamentalism and a conservative cultural politics that are in tension with one another.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. I think that's a very good point. And I actually, I was tempted. I wasn't sure because what I like about the book is that it's quite you guys really do have an audience in mind of non-specialists and specifically people who are not necessarily scholars but are practitioners and are business people and so it also works as a way of introduction to business ethics. So there's a lot of work that I suspect, would be maybe discussed in more in depth that maybe you don't talk about because it's just not as useful. It would be a distraction. But I think is would be interested to hear your thoughts on here, which is to say the idea of spontaneous order and the market, and because we're getting a little bit about that more market fundamentalism. I mean, one misconception about what we do here in our fellowships is people tend to think we do Chicago school economics, which is not the case, as you probably know. We do Austrian economics, Virginia school, and Bloomington school, which is Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom, essentially, and Virginia school being public choice theory, and Austrian economics being Hayek and others. But I bring up Hayek because the spontaneous order, emergent order point. One of the points that you guys make, which I like, is that spontaneous order of the market isn't really so natural, or often is characterized as very naturalized and very spontaneous in a very formalistic sense, but it's actually something that is enabled through certain institutions. And it's something that society enables too, because we know there are social benefits from market processes. It might be the case, maybe, that markets are things that like have a public benefit that people don't intend initially when they are pursuing certain business interests. But it's still the case that we do there is a sort of political element to this. So I guess I did want to ask more about what you guys mean there in terms of thinking about what's the danger in treating commerce and business as having kind of a purely spontaneous kind of grounding.
I'm just wondering, like, so what's the benefit? Or like, and maybe another way to think about it, what would be the benefits of thinking about it as spontaneous order? And I guess from a normative perspective, I would imagine that the benefit would be to say that it generates outcomes that are kind of have the power of being natural, or they have the power of being better than what could have been designed by people, right? And I guess that this is in part an empirical question. So the like our stance is not pro market or against market. Our question is about society's capacity to assess what the market outcomes, assess how social processes work, and correct them accordingly. So if particular school of economics gets it right, and if we're following their policy, we get outcomes that members of society, upon reflection, can decide that these are good outcomes. We want this capacity. So it's not about choosing the right economic approach, but focusing on our ability to assess and reflect and revise based on the outcomes of specific policies. So I think that we are kind of in the book not taking position on which, like, how big the market can be or how small it can be, whether the government can be or big or small. We want, with one point we described as having a smart government rather than big or small government, and in a sense not government but smart social, political social organization, democratic organization that allows society to monitor and reflect on outcomes of social processes.
Yeah, and I think that was really well put, Amit. And I guess like the way is that if we view markets as just these kind of catalactic, spontaneous orders, first of all, I doubt historically and empirically that that's accurate. But more important, it sort of forecloses precisely the questions that Amit was introducing, right? It's just a spontaneous thing. Like, how can we inquire whether this is right or wrong, good or bad? Whereas if we take seriously the way in which the nature of property rights, the nature of competition, the nature of market structure are, socially situated and constructed, then we can then inquire into whether we like it this way, whether we should revise these, what purposes or justifications these sorts of orders and patterns might have.
I mean, just like we are also addressing the kind of the anti-Hayek or the socialist approach. So our, like, we argue that what we discuss and what we articulate in the book applies equally to market socialism. So to the extent that, to the extent that there are markets and businesses, the society organizes like economics based on businesses that compete for profit, the considerations that we discuss are relevant as well. So it's like socialism would not take away the dilemmas of relationship between profit enterprise or profit interest and democracy that we bring up.
Great, great. Yeah, no, that's excellent. And what I find very compelling too about bringing democracy into the conversation is at times reading Hayek and other thinkers, one could actually argue that some of the defenses of the market as a comparative in comparison to political institutions almost rely on a kind of a normative democratic position, which is to say there's a champion of a consumer sovereignty, and that what market competition enables is there to be kind of a diffusion of decision making, and businesses are to some degree dependent on the preferences of consumers. And even you see this in Hayek's response to John Kenneth Galbraith on advertising, that even if there's strong marketing claims, there's other kind of social actors, individuals who shape these dynamics. But I think what I bring that up more to say, if you look at those arguments in those terms, then it's quite natural to then ask, well, okay, if one of the reasons why markets are good is because they have this democratic potential, then what does that actually mean? Shouldn't that be more than just how we think about the market, but how we think about the actors within the market and their commitments to democracy? I'd be interested if you have any reactions to that, but it's more a segue also into if you guys could just also lay out for the audience more what you mean by democracy, because again, I think people coming from different disciplines and also the public themselves kind of have different understandings of what especially democratic theorists say when they say democracy. Sometimes people assume it just means majoritarian decision making, for example, but it's quite clear that you guys have much more complex and nuanced view, and it is much more about social and informal processes too.
So maybe a way of getting into that is that the I really like that overview of seeing the market in terms of its sort of being a democratic decision maker, or facilitating a certain type of but of course what's important is to the degree that the market does that through people in their roles as consumers or market participants. And of course, one of the key ideas about that comes from democratic theory is the idea that when we engage in these things, we should be doing so as citizens. Kevin Elliott has a recent book where he argues that we should think of citizenship as a type of office. And he's not the first to argue this, but he articulates that well, right? That is, it's a position that we occupy that comes with certain sorts of considerations and requires a certain orientation towards others and decision making. And so the point would be that whatever the virtues of the market as this kind of information gathering machine that allows us to distill preferences and relative supply and demand in a pretty quick way, and we think there are virtues to that. It doesn't do the work of what we think democracy needs to do, right? Which is facilitate decisions as democratic citizens. Now, you raised the $1 million question, which is what does that mean? What does democracy mean? And as you note, there's a lot of disagreement about that, including and especially amongst democratic theorists. And I'm going to pass it to Amit in a second. But one way, maybe a way of, because he's the real democratic theorist. No, but is Amit, actually, maybe I'd be curious if you say if you agree with this characterization. Part of what we do is also say that disagreement about what democracy demands has to be part of a definition of democracy. That is, part of what a theory of what democracy requires is figuring out collectively what it demands of us, right, and what it entails institutionally and socially. Amit, is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And I'll try to maybe connect the two strands of the question, which is about the markets as a democratic mechanism, which I think our starting point or the approaches that we build upon, and we build on Knight and Johnson, the idea of the priority of democracy, which is that there is truth to that, but it is a democratic mechanism and not necessarily the democratic mechanism. So it's one mechanism that can support democracy, but not necessarily democracy has more beyond that. And the way that I think we are thinking about democracy is like democracy is a group of ideas and values, including voting, participation, inclusion, equality, accountability, rule of law, that are in complex relationship with each other and many times in some tension with each other. And I think different approaches to democratic theory, like different approaches, focus on particular element of this group of values and features them as the central. And I think that it's interesting rather than decide who is right to think what happens when we go with particular way of thinking about democracy and where it leads us. And I think that the one that we put at the center in thinking about the relationship of businesses to democracy is the one of reflexivity and capacity for experimentation. So for us, what characterizes democracy is that society has the ability to reflect and revise on its decisions, to assess them, to monitor, to evaluate, to reflect and to revise um, in a way that includes the perspectives of everyone. And what we are interested in is how businesses not support or not interfere with this capacity. Um, so in that sense, it's Durian pragmatist. It's the ability of democracy to engage in experimentation and in a way that other kinds of regimes can do only in a limited way because they don't have the built-in mechanisms of reflexivity.
That's great. And actually, I was going to just to add and to flesh out that too, because I love that. I think the idea of reflexivity, of revision, reflection, and collectively and with inclusion, it's such a useful framework for then getting at, and we'll get to in a second, the problems that we see. Like, when do businesses act contrary to those commitments and democratic goals? But before we get there, I did want to then sort of flesh out this idea too. What you guys are clear about too is you argue that businesses aren't well situated to, and they should be following the law. So it's not an argument for a, something outside of the law, and in that sense, then too, you guys are careful to note that this might still be relevant, and well, you say it should be relevant even in political contexts that are not democratic. So even in regimes that are not formally democratic or do not have full democratic procedures. And so I guess yeah, I just was interested in you fleshing out that part of the argument. Why, when we're talking about democracy, it's you're neither giving like a basis for when to go against the law, but you're also arguing for even when the democratic procedures aren't in place or democratic formal institutions aren't in place, there's still the value of thinking democratically in the business world.
Yeah, I think our thinking about that somewhat evolved the way that we conceptualize that when we began writing the book. We like our line was that we are dealing with democracies. We are not dealing with business like outside of Auschwitz or like in extreme situations that are non-democratic or and North Korea. And so we want to ask about the obligations of businesses in democratic society where there's some kind of social consensus about like it's democracy is practiced. The more like we thought about it and discussed it, the more it became clear to us that some kind of a bright line is not particularly helpful in thinking about the particular problems that businesses are facing because like governments or regimes do not sort themselves out easily into democratic and non-democratic. And as even established democracies have non-democratic tendencies. The question of like when do we cross the line? When you can like toss our book because it's no longer relevant, and becomes complicated. And I think that the way we think about it now, and maybe is that businesses always have the obligation to assess and reflect about the environment in which they operate in and their role in relation to this environment. Um, but and there's another strand of the argument of the book that in general we don't think that businesses is in such a position to bring about progressive change. They're not necessarily and should not necessarily see themselves as an agent of social progress and revision. That task is for citizens. So we think that businesses should be reflective of the way in which their participation in complicity with non-democratic practices might undermine society's capacity to bring about these kind of values of democracy. It's relevant if they operate in the United States. It may be more complicated and less relevant, for example, if they operate in China. But we don't think that businesses have an obligation, say, since either government may be democratic or non-democratic, to be agents of resistance.
Yeah, no, no, no. And maybe to add on to that and connect it to the first part of your question about following the law. So we have this chapter on the rule of law and sort of the normative or moral status of laws for businesses. And one of the ideas that we get across, and here we discuss Martin Luther King's famous theory of civil disobedience and the way it was taken up by John Rawls and others, which is to say there is a democratic justification for lawbreaking, right? There are democratic reasons and democratic maybe obligations to break unjust laws. But the point is, and one of the things that King famously outlines is there's a large list of sort of procedures that you need to go to know for sure that you're breaking the law in a democratic spirit, in a spirit of justice and equality. And our argument is that businesses are not well positioned to do that, right? That is something that a citizen does. And when you are operating in the C-suite, you're operating as executive of a corporation. And therefore you're not in the position to engage in, for instance, what King calls self-purification, or all these other justifications or things that you need to go through to redeem the process of law breaking. And so the argument is because of that, there's a general preference, a general disposition that businesses ought to have for following the law, just because they should be deeply skeptical of their own ability to break the law the right way. And I think that's connected with what Amit was saying about being agents for change, right? It's not that there's something wrong with doing that, clearly not. We should favor things to become more democratic. It's businesses should be deeply anxious about their ability to be vanguards for that sort of democratic change, right? Precisely because of the nature of the incentives they face and the positions that they occupy.
And and I think that's like the situate this argument against claims by business leaders, and they quote Uber and about their law breaking as part of innovation, like that there's need to be businesses need to disregard the law when they think it justified in the name of an innovation, in the sense that law limits or hinders innovation.
Well, and like even like kind of incredibly from our perspective, right, is that they tie that to a straightforward reference to Martin Luther King, right? So you have Uber sort of explaining why they're disregarding local laws, against what they're doing or against ride sharing businesses, and sort of saying like, no, these are unjust laws, and in the spirit of MLK, we need to like, release the fleet of cars or whatever. So, you know, getting at that idea of like, there's always not just a tendency, but a very high likelihood that you're going to get engaged in incredibly motivated reasoning when you have these justifications on hand, and so therefore there should be a general sort of allergy to reaching for them because you can't trust your ability to use them well.
And our argument is not necessarily that these are just laws, and therefore breaking the law would be immoral, but that allowing powerful players to um, undermine the democratic process kind of takes away the capacity of citizens to assess and revise according to their more inclusive, more reflective interests.
Great, yeah. No, it's interesting because and that case in particular is fascinating to me because we actually in one of our fellowships we read we discuss public choice theory, Virginia School. We read the transitional gains trap literature. And Uber's often given as an example of a, company that is or essentially Uber and Lyft, all these rideshare companies, as being the main way that there was a way out of the transitional gains trap in terms of taxi medallions, for example. And so the idea there is that so I'm very struck by also, the potential similarities, but also disagreements between your emphasis on democracy and something like a public choice critique because and we'll get into some of the problems that you guys articulate are lobbying are the sort of the conversion of financial and economic power into very unequal political power in various methods. And so from like the public choice perspective, one might say, okay, there were these privileges established by through the taxi medallion system. It's very difficult to undo these things politically, but then economically, an actor comes along and pursuing their self interest that kind of dismantles that privilege. But then what you guys are suggesting is that this is an undemocratic way to kind of go about, and they aren't necessarily properly situated to think in these terms. And just to underscore, because I wouldn't say, I'm not necessarily defending the public choice argument I just stated. What's interesting to me is that then you read thinkers like James Buchanan in this tradition where they have quite a suspicion of civil disobedience, I would say overall, and quite a preference for a more kind of law is what is what establishes and enables kind of social interaction and exchange. And so kind of it's interesting to me that you've now kind of pinpointed a tension here between the idea of market competition as a way out of bad, you know, quote unquote bad political frameworks. but in a way that is actually extra legal or extrajudicial in potentially worrisome ways.
No, I was just going to ask you a question, Kristen, because you know the literature, but just like why do you think? Because I had never thought of it that way, but it is sort of surprising that there's like this hewing to legality here when they're so in favor of this type of disruption, right? Like that they would see the Uber case and say like it's good that this be disrupted.
But I think it works when like the argument is that laws and regulations should be minimal. So they like the laws when like they're minimal and establish the property relations, but they don't like the laws when their purpose is to regulate or to redistribute.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm doing some broad strokes of the sort of political philosophical frameworks, but it is also there's a tension. Then there is tensions within these schools, and it's something that we talk about in our fellowships of an Austrian approach, which is much more maybe even, is much more concerned with potential of market institutions and even these being able to be dependent on social norms and formal norms and things like this. Versus if you read James Buchanan and his approach to constitutional political economy, much more interested in no, we need moments of design. They need to have unanimity, and there are historically issues in terms of how this has happened. But in order to have kind of a market get off the ground in the first place, you want to have rules of the game that are well established. And often that does require. But then I mean, you guys are, what we're talking about here is the actual messiness of politics, in that you may have less than ideal legal regulations from one of the standpoints of these schools, but then how do you get at political change of that regulation? And I think that that's just kind of we're not going to be able to settle that here, but it gets into there's really no way out of the political question essentially, right? Because either you have to figure out legal processes. If you think that legal regulations are in the way of markets and businesses, you have to figure out some way to resolve that, and either that's through the political process, or you have to have a justification for why it's right to reject the legal frameworks that you are meant to, subscribe to on the virtue of a liberal society.
And one of the things that we try to make clear in the book is that there are no good guys. Like we work in a like we think social interactions as complex environments in which there are no good guys or bad guys. So we don't think necessarily that what government or what the actual democratic process produces is necessarily justified or legitimate. And we don't think that necessarily what businesses are doing is wrong or like right or wrong. But we try to, so instead of trying to think of what would be the ideal division of labor between businesses and government, we think of how to think about it as an ongoing interaction that begins with a point of non-ideal situation, which there's in which the very distinction between what is right or what is wrong, what is justified, and what is unjustified is itself being disputed. And also we don't think that business ethics would be the solution, like to every problem. So we don't think like and like we don't anticipate and so like aim towards some kind of ideal cooperation between businesses and democracy and
Well, so then this gets us a little bit more in terms of okay, the types of problems that you diagnose a lot of different problems, potential issues once you have this emphasis on political theory and democratic theory. And so I was hoping maybe you'd be interested in kind of fleshing out some of those ideas in terms of lobbying, in terms of bribery. One of the things that I really appreciate is also you have the concept of duplicitous exclusion. And so the problem of kind of unknown and unaccountable lobbying. And so and some of and some of these problems, it's even legal and less overtly corrupt lobbying as being unethical and something we should be concerned with from a democratic perspective.
Yeah, so just as you were sort of alluding to, the way the book is structured is that each chapter then goes through different scenarios or different sorts of situations or different types of ways in which businesses can affect the democratic quality of a society or the democratic practices or certain commitments to democracy. and we try to introduce an idea from democratic theory in each chapter that our readers might not be aware with, and sort of explain it, and then sort of show how it like business decisions, and not necessarily extraordinary business decisions, sometimes very ordinary ones, that this concern or this idea kind of can hang in the balance or can be deeply affected by these decisions. You've read the book more recently than we have, Kristen, if I recall, though, so it's questions about bribery and corruption, questions about lobbying are the first those chapters. Then the relationship of marketing to democratic deliberation, the role of social movements and the sorts of obligations that businesses have with regards to them, and then the relationship of businesses to certain types of democratic communities and the types of democratic practices or the sort of informal practices that democracy requires that businesses can undermine.
I'll try to go into the lobbying, which is so our starting point again is thinking in a non-ideal way is to make a distinction between the question of whether lobbying is ethical and the question of the ethics of lobbying. So there are different approaches to democratic, what democracy means, and whether lobbying has a place in democracy. And what we are trying to do in the book is kind of bracket these kinds of questions and say like there are some arguments in favor of lobbying, there are some arguments against lobbying. Lobbying can be justified based on certain reasons. It can be dangerous to democracy based on certain reasons. And that is a question for democracy to decide. It suggests that democracy may be consistent with different lobbying regimes. And as we said, businesses have basically an obligation to respect the outcomes of like the decisions or the regime that democracy established that regulates the lobbying. But then the question is how can like what can we say about the um, the ethics of lobbying? How should businesses handle lobbying in a way that is ethical way, given that society tells them, like democracy tells them, we want to hear your voice. We create spaces for you to speak your mind as part of the legislative or regulatory process. And here we talk about different models of democracy, but what we try to get it is that what we want businesses to avoid and affecting affecting decisions in a way that undermines the democratic process. And we adopt the idea of duplicitous corruption as it's an argument by Mark Warren, a political theory from UBC, um, and the question, the question it tries to answer is what is the harm of corruption to democracy? Why is corruption problematic to democracy? And he suggests that corruption is problematic because it creates certain kind of exclusion that is duplicitous. That people believe that they're included, but in fact they're excluded. So, and part of the argument is that exclusion in itself is not necessarily undemocratic. Like I cannot vote in a different city. I cannot vote in like not everyone can be included in any particular thing. And also duplicity is not necessarily undemocratic in the sense that like strategy or certain kind of withholding information can be part of the political process, but they become a threat to democracy when they're combined, when people believe that they're included, but in fact they're excluded, and they lose their ability to trust the veracity of the process, or trust the integrity of the process. And what we argue in the chapter is that many of our kind of intuitions about what's wrong with certain practices of lobbying can be captured by this idea of duplicitous exclusion, or kind of creating duplicitous exclusion, in the sense that certain practices of lobbying create the illusion that citizens participate, but in fact, they're not, or they do that on like unequal or unfair ground. So, take for example what we describe as epistemic exclusion or epistemic corruption, which that businesses hold information, maintain information that is relevant for the public discussion, but they do not share it with the public, and like important information. So this kind of practice prevents citizens from the ability to actually assess and to kind of engage in equal footing with the businesses with when they're lobbying, or what we describe as representational exclusion. When when lobbyists claim to speak on behalf of citizens or in the name of citizens, um, claiming to represent them and therefore excluding the actual citizens from participating in the process. And again, each one of these things is complex and nuanced, and we talk about in the chapter, but that would be cases where lobbying we think is unethical from the point of view of democracy.
Just to highlight, like, of course, we're bracketing the question about whether the certain laws or regime of lobbying we have is good or bad. That doesn't mean that we think the lobbying regime we operate in today is justified or good, right? The point is that's for something that's for the democratic process to figure out. Businesses shouldn't be unilaterally making those decisions. Instead, they have these sort of second order moral obligations.
Well, then I guess that does lead me to ask. I mean, would you say there are a lot of the focus is kind of thinking in the business ethics context and from the point of view of being making decisions in business, how to think about democracy. But are there arguments here that you would want to emphasize in terms of how this should make us think differently about democracy? I mean, it is obviously I appreciate, the deference to democratic communities, members of the communities. But that is itself, I think a claim that how do you potentially make the political economic system more responsive and channeling. But yeah, so are there thoughts here then in terms of how this should think make us think about democracy? And then I have some questions about more kind of maybe if you don't mind bringing this in conversation with more recent political issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the sort of general account of democracy, that we think should be endorsed by, maybe the book urges us this way. I'll mention two sort of things that we think, two desiderata, or two things that we think would be good for a theory of democracy, or we think are necessary for a theory of democracy. One would be to follow Knight and Johnson in their emphasis on institutional pluralism.
That's great. Actually, I was going to ask about the institutional pluralism, so I'm glad you're.
So this sort of, and as Amit already noticed, that we're or noted that we're very influenced by Dewey and Deweyan theories of democracy. And the key idea for Dewey, as a good pragmatist, is that democracy is fundamentally a problem solving commitment, right? Like it's a style of solving problems. And what Knight and Johnson lay out is that in a complex society, problems are going to be complex, and there's little reason we should believe that there will be one solution, or that the solution for everything will be the same. And so the point is to recognize that, for questions of equal adjudication, we'll need one set of institutions like courts. For problems of allocation, we might use markets. For problems of coordinations, we might use firms or bureaucracy or whatever, right? That society is going to be marked by a number of problems and therefore a number of different institutional solutions. And on their account, and we agree with this strongly, is that democracy, the role of democracy isn't to replace all of those different institutions, right? There's reasons to have that institutional complexity, right? To have different institutions. Democracy is meant as this kind of, what democracy enjoys is what they call the second order priority, which is the mechanism and the procedure by which we then reassess and question and revise these institutional selections, right? Is the market doing what we want it to do? If not, what do we tinker with? Do we replace it? Do we augment it? Is our courts, our bureaucracy, our, social norms, are all of these things doing what we hope they can do? Or do we have other problems that we need to solve through different means? So that I think would be one. And I think in our own way, what we're trying to contribute to is thinking about what that looks like from the perspective of a business manager, right? That is, you are operating within a very specific sort of institution that is idiosyncratic in all of its ways, that has a certain problem solving function that is worth preserving, at least by hypothesis. And yet there's a sort of overarching democratic concern that you're not entitled to avoid or ignore just by virtue of being a market participant. So institutional pluralism is I think a crucial idea. The second is maybe what we might think of as a wide view of democracy as opposed to a thin procedural view of democracy. So there's a certain, in the academy and also outside of the academy, of thinking about democracy just in terms of, competitive elections, or sometimes not even competitive elections, right? Like elections, responsive parties, a representative Congress, right? Like, and once you get that, you got democracy, jobs done. And I think if we endorse the problem solving view of democracy, we recognize that, that's one problem. Like those procedures are important, right? Because they solve a very important problem, namely how to make decisions for a large society marked by differences, right? But that's not the only problem that we'll need to address through equal inclusion, like through empowered inclusion. And so then we also have to be concerned with how agendas are set, right? How ideas filter into this process, how people relate to their more local communities. And that's going to mean that democracy is going to also, I don't want to say filter down because that implies a sort of order of operations or an order of priority, but that it's going to pervade all levels of society. So democracy is going to demand those procedures, but it also demands a type of openness to deliberation. It also demands a respect for social movements and so forth. Amit, with anything, what did I miss?
Yeah, maybe one which is very obvious but very important, which is that economic inequality may be a problem for democracy. So that we live in a society that business are empowered by society to be very powerful. And leaving aside the question of that, what should be the ideal or whether this is justified, by giving them so much power, we create the potential of undermining society's capacity to engage in this reflective revision. So that's a central concern or problem for democracy.
Great. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, because I mean, and AB gave a great overview. So just building on that and connecting that to what I was interested in, this idea of like connecting this to more recent political debates and events, and especially because this has been going on since for years. I mean, and also in the history of political thought, thinking about economic inequality and political power is enduring. You see that throughout the history of the intellectual tradition. But especially now, since the recession, 2008 recession, the Occupy Wall Street protests, Citizens United, and then getting to more recently with Trump's second term and how quickly business executives, I mean, both were already in support of his campaign, but also once he won the election, kind of coalesced around him and supported the inauguration, went to the inauguration, and that now, amongst the public, much more of scrutiny of these, so-called tech oligarchs, let's say, are a new term for oligarchy for our very online society. So I wanted to kind of bring that into the conversation in terms of, since publishing the book and seeing some of those more recent events, like, have you had thoughts on kind of how your work has, speaks to these issues, or also just, how should we be thinking about this in terms of, other business leaders who see this? I mean, what would you say to them, whether they would emulate this attempt to kind of cozy up to the, political officials and try to take advantage of potential patronage, patrimonialism, and those types of dynamics today?
A couple of thoughts I don't think it's particularly insightful, but like in one sense, our book is to nuance ammunition to deal with this problem because it's wrong in such an obvious way that the arguments that we make are too nuanced to deal with this kind of problem. But still, I think that like two other insights that come from the book is that first, this is only one instance, or the way that uh, oligarchs or leaders of business intervene openly with government is only one way in which businesses affect democracy, and we should not ignore the many other ways in which they do so, and are arguably equally influential, although sometimes more opaque. And the other is that I think it's an important distinction, although a complex one, which we talk about businesses and not about rich people. And some of these people have both roles in that. But I think that there's different kinds of ethical considerations that relate to the role of executives that run businesses versus people who have a lot of money they don't know what to do with, or they actually do know what to do with.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo, there is a certain way in which, like, the book is a dealing with. So we have this one chapter where we talk about Elon Musk and when his opening of a Tesla factory during a COVID lockdown, and how it was unethical, and then a few months later, there he is in Doge, right? So there's a degree to which, like, we're talking about very, like, certain types of detailed questions, and you don't need our book to answer the question of, like, what's undemocratic about what's going on. That but I think maybe it highlights kind of the two problems we've been getting at. So on the one hand, it sort of explain it. I think it helps kind of detail or give the argument in favor of the sort of easy assumption, right? Which is why businesses aren't entitled to cozy up and sort of capture government institutions just because it's profitable or good for the bottom line, right? So, because you can imagine a certain way of looking at it, which is like, of course, we're cozying up to power. We're trying to get a favorable position because it's good for our shareholders. And I think what our book details is an explanation of, like, yes, but in doing that, you're undermining the democratic process, which we need to oversee these economic situations, and therefore that is not a pursuit of shareholder value that you're entitled to pursue, right? On the other hand, I think there's, at least, at the level of rhetoric they're arguing, and I think there's probably something to this, where I think there's a lot of businesses and a lot of executives, so like, just on that first point, like, that picture of, was it at the inauguration where there's the tech bros in front of the cabinet?
Yes, yeah.
Right, seated, right? Like, so that in and of itself is just a problem, right? Perfectly captures the problem. So one response to that would be like, yeah, this is why it's wrong for businesses to just be so profit minded, right? But of course, a lot of businesses might, and Zuckerberg has kind of said things like this, in the wake of it, where it's like, no, we need to return to a masculist culture, or protect free speech. So that there's some of the support for this regime isn't just profit minded. Some of it, I think, comes from a certain view of what the right values are, and that's also a problem from our perspective, right? Because businesses just shouldn't be. It's undemocratic for businesses to be using their economic and political positions to be pursuing these things.
No, I think that that makes a lot of sense. But I think the other kind of question I have about this is is there a parallel here between, and I hesitate to ask this because it's distinct. Like you're very, I mean, you guys do talk about workplace democracy, but you also are situating the book as in a distinct vein from that. But there's something very striking, or I think at least from the public's frustration or resentment of these figures, a lot of it has to do with also the immense executive power many business executives have within their companies, and depending on their domination of their industries, therefore then policies, so especially tech is a situation where everyone's on social media. There's only so many social media companies, so at least only so many social media companies that have the benefit of kind of the network effect of people who are on there and why you would want to be on there in the first place. And then therefore all the policy decisions that get made at those companies are something that people are really, faced they were interacting with, whether they understand how they work or not. There was conservatives for a long time very concerned with shadow banning, those types of things. So my question is, is there a way also that there's a parallel here between the problems of executive organization and central power in the executive in both the private sphere and businesses, and the rise, and this predates Trump obviously in the US, but the growth of centralized executive power that we should be thinking about, and how this kind of emphasis on democracy as like an antidote to both forms of executive power in either sphere.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, first thought I have, and then Amit, you can again tell me where I go wrong. Is so we could think about the significance of democratizing something like a business, so checking the centralized power of the executive. you could think of there being a number of justifications for why we should do this, right? One is that democracy demands it just in and of itself, right? That there's just something fundamentally undemocratic about people having to live under the authority during their working days and sometimes beyond those working days, working hours of an unaccountable boss. And therefore, workplaces and corporations should be democratized just sort of as a deontological matter, right? Like or by principle, people have the right to not be subject to this type of authority. The other, which is sort of, if I heard correctly, sort of what you might be suggesting is that we should democratize it because a disciplined and more accountable executive is less likely to use their power in ways that corrupt democracy at large. And so I think so to the first one, we are sympathetic to that, right? So we sort of in the book don't make the argument that all businesses need to be democratized as a matter of like by fiat, but that we think there is a strong justification for a preference for democratic workplaces. On the second one, I mean, so there's that. In terms of but we don't center that in our argument because we think a perfectly democratic workplace can still, in principle, pose all of these problems for democracy at large, right? Like the fact that my co-op is democratically governed doesn't mean that they're not using undue influence with our aldermen and to get zoning changes that override democratic, community empowerment, right? Like there's nothing that doesn't logically follow. Now, empirically, there's some evidence to suggest that cooperatives and democratic workplaces and democratic organizations tend to behave more ethically. I tend to think I'm never entirely sure how much of that is like a democratic discipline effect and how much of that is a selection effect. So we think there's reasons to reduce the centralized power of executives within corporations. How much that would change the course of where we're at now, or how much that would like prevent them from using their power, I'm not entirely sure. Amit, what do you?
I mean, just in the first part of the question, or the other element, which maybe we'll give a shout out to a recent book by Pierre-Yves Neron, called "Think Like a Firm" from Oxford, I think 2024, where he's arguing that there is certain kind of connection between conservatism at the level of government and conservatism in the business community. And he argues that specifically about theories of economic management, that they're indirectly influenced by ideas about inequalities and the conservative ideas. Yeah, so that's not the argument that we make in the book, but it's an argument that is out there. And I think it aligns with what I made, the point I made previously, that inequality is a problem, and we live in an environment in which businesses have significant power, and we have to be mindful about the way that they exercise their power.
We started this conversation with, and this was not recorded, but Abe asked if he was allowed to ask me questions. So you haven't been asking me questions, Abe, not to give you too hard a time, but I thought I was going to be, I thought this was going to be more of I shouldn't say inquisition, but
Well, I was trying to get you to expound on public choice a bit more, but
yeah,
uh,
maybe I punted that one.
no, but maybe to get to the episodes that you've done this season on like introducing more deliberation into meta and the sort of processes of doing that. I mean, we were sort of talking about this before, or sort of, we maybe have some thoughts on it. But yeah, we would be sort of curious to know, I mean, not just about our book in particular, but like, how does this sort of conversation or this way of thinking about the problem, do you think affect the way we should be assessing these sorts of decisions or processes?
The processes like a deliberation process at a company like Meta. Yeah, I mean, well, that's why as I wanted. Did you guys? I mean, it's totally okay, and we won't out you on the episode. But did you guys listen to either of those episodes?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. I wasn't sure. Like, I didn't want to assume you guys had. I mean, here's the thing. I mean, that's what I think is interesting is that it seems like to some degree, and this is just as an outside observer, it seems like to some degree businesses are always making certain policy decisions, both policy as in their policies that govern, like, let's just take a social media company, policies around content moderation, but then also decisions around who they have in charge of policy teams, or how they market themselves, the kind of speeches that they give. It was such a the sort of rhetoric there. There's a way in which there's always maybe some gestures toward whatever the current presidential administration is, or dominant political party, or wherever the trends of public discourse are. And so what I think is fascinating is to see how much of, I would say, like, an intellectual whiplash in terms of culturally what has happened in this country, and how quickly those, again, if we maybe just say some of those things are relatively superficial, but changes in personnel, like who's in charge of these programs, the way that they, the announcements. It was interesting doing that episode, and having recorded an episode with with Chris Rosametta, who's fantastic, by the way. I also have always been very complimentary about Chris, and I'm very grateful that they gave us the chance to talk about what they've done in an excellent work. I think it's very unique what they were doing. And as Alice Sue said, when organizations invest into these types of processes, I do think that's a sign of commitment, at least somewhere, right? But then you have that announcement in January, right as we were going to release the episode, where there's like a major shift in content moderation policy, and it's very unclear kind of what's going on here, and how do we assess. I mean, there wasn't really a lot of statistics given in terms of how many, what the negative error rate was, in terms of posts being taken down, and what kind of that shouldn't have been taken down, and then what this policy will actually fix. And so I do think that, I guess, that's why I am kind of wondering. I agree with you what you said before about changing the structure within the firms isn't necessarily going to lead to more democratic outcomes by any means. But I do wonder how much, when we see in government central authority also having less transparency and less, you know, publicity means that we can't assess what's going on. I do wonder how much that's also the case in a private organization as well. Now, again, in both cases, the arguments are always, well, you need to have, and I'm somebody who's quite defensive overall about privacy and secrecy, but I'm defensive of them because of conditions of inequality. I think people who are particularly vulnerable to oppression, for example, they're the ones that need those tools. But we look at society and it seems like mostly it's companies who have proprietary protections to not share information, to not allow for, deliberation. So there's something very disappointing to me, I would say, looking at the current political moment, where it seems like maybe there was progress within companies being interested in the type of more democratic approaches you guys are arguing for. But it seems like some of that's kind of irrelevant if the broader political structure is tending towards a more, centralized or autocratic regime. But I don't know. That's sort of, I don't know if that's, I don't have a question back at you, but if you, and I hope that was, sensible or understandable.
I think one way that the book may help us think through that is between the distinction in terms of transparency between what we describe as first order decisions and second order decisions of democracy, which the first order decisions are particular policies, like whether the level of pollution should be 4.2 or 4.5. So that's an outcome of a democratic process, particular decisions about and particular policies. Then there are second order decisions about the process by which these decisions would be made. So, for example, the first order decision is whether to have COVID vaccine. Second order decision is who makes the decisions about whether there will be vaccine and to whom the vaccine will be administered, right? And we argue that businesses have and the obligations for democracy is stronger about the second order decisions. And I think also the obligations for transparency. So businesses are entitled to privacy or secrecy about particular elements of the strategy or products that is part of what they're doing. They have less expectation or should have less expectation for privacy in decisions where they affect democratic processes. So if a business takes away certain kinds of protections for vulnerable people or for public deliberations, they should be expected to provide justification that can be debated by the public.
I mean, one thought that I had relating to what you said, which I found fascinating, and Amit's answer to it is, and we sort of maybe gesture at some of this in the book, but does the nature or does the degree of these permissions or obligations change when the government in question has radically, changes, right? So as things become more secretive and less public in the state institution, does an institution like Meta take on more obligations to be more transparent? That in terms of we think there's generally a need to be transparent or public with second order things that have second order effects. But we might say, look, like the possibilities for participation and inclusion in the normal channels is being precluded. So maybe Meta has an extra obligation to actually create these venues for deliberation or participation, absent something like that. I'm not sure if that would be correct, but there's something at least plausible or attractive about that type of argument.
I mean, that's attractive as an ideal, but I think when we think about it in terms of like the political reality, it seems like it's precisely in those moments that it's going to be structurally harder to expect. Like their incentives are such that cozying up is not only, an argument could be made, and I'm not necessarily defending this, but an argument could be made. An executive feels I must cozy up, I must fall in line, even if it's relatively superficial, and in order to protect my employees, in order to protect our possibility of, actually, this was a debate that I was having with friends about Twitter, whether Elon Musk getting so involved in Trump's administration was going to lead to Twitter's kind of success finally, because even before Musk, they had some issues in the digital advertising industry. But the argument being, oh, all these companies that left Twitter are now going to go back because they're going to be subject to federal scrutiny. And in fact, there was that Wall Street Journal report about that sort of thing happening, but it has not happened on a widespread scale. And so yeah, so that I mean, that is just to say that, like, it seems like the more that there then becomes an intertwining of not only government moving away from democracy, but also government towards more political contracting and public private partnerships, more of that. I guess we also have this framework at the Hayek Program of entangled political economy, but I think as political scientists, I think we're always kind of thinking about these actors as entangled to some degree. But yeah, it seems like that's precisely when that's less likely to happen.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And to be clear, and you'll know this, but for people who haven't read the book, Amit and I are not particularly sanguine about like the businesses being good venues for democratic deliberation, right? We're pretty. So this is an argument that was put forward famously by Sharon Palazzo in a view that's often called political corporate social responsibility, that corporations have the responsibility to cultivate their cultivate democratic legitimacy through deliberation. And I think there's a lot of merit to it, but we're skeptical that businesses are properly situated to do that. And I think you're exactly right that especially in those times we should be even less confident in their abilities to do it. Though I think, and this is something Amit and I were talking about, is that in the case of Meta, they did things about it that make that process a little more have, we think, more integrity, that they enlisted a third party, that they were sort of forthcoming with these things. So there's better and worse ways of doing this.
They've published a lot on it. I mean, that was definitely, and that's the thing is, like, I was being harsh, I guess, on the context of releasing that episode, and it's like, well, this is quite a weird time to release what I think is actually quite interesting. Like, they did a lot of work to make that quite legitimate, but then it was not cited in any of the policy changes, which makes you wonder, okay, will it ever be cited? What is the relationship?
I think that part of the purpose of the book and why we write this is not like business ethics is not just for executives that run businesses, it's also for citizens to think about the standards by which they hold business executives. And And the standards should take into account the fact that their judgments are sometimes complicated. So, you might have to cozy up to government to protect your employees, which might be a legitimate reason. It can also to protect yourself or the bottom line, which is less complicated. But so we have to think about the standards that we apply to businesses. And I think what you just said also vindicate the suggestion that there's no bright line between democracies and non-democracies. That the dilemmas are complex, both in like also in established democracies.
No, I think that's right. I mean, not to, make this about me, but I was wondering, do you have any other thoughts? Like, what were your reactions to the episodes you listened to? You did say, there were some things that Meta did that made that process a higher quality deliberative process.
Yeah, we had a lot of we thought about it. It's a complex case, so I think that we don't think that businesses in general we don't think it's the business of business to support democracy, to facilitate democracy. That's not. But if they do so if they do so well, it's we don't have anything against that. It's better to have more deliberation based if they want to support and underwrite deliberation. Like we are not concerned about the bottom line and how they use their finances. That's not our concern here. And but we do think it's a risky enterprise from the point of view of democracy because we know the people at Stanford and we know the institution that we relied on and we trust them. But maybe another uh, media company can establish, can work with another institution that we don't know, and they can claim legitimacy for a process that is less than ideal. And it would be hard to make these distinctions. So deliberative processes can be easily manipulated, and people are selected, the questions that they are asked, and the kind of moderation, the kind of information. So this can be a risky kind of process from the perspective of democracy to the extent that actually the deliberative process, people are perceived the outcome as more legitimate.
That's great. And that's also to a broader point about politics in that there are ways in which democracy can be mimicked, can be imitated, can be put on as a show. Peter Pomerantsev is a British journalist who has books on Russia, and that was actually his works on essentially kind of Russia using and Putin's administration using kind of techniques, honestly, from reality TV to kind of create this appearance of democracy. Anyway, Abe, did you have something you were going to add?
No, no, I just or maybe just to put a cap on what Amit was saying. So we found it pretty compelled. We were really interested when we talked about it. We were like, oh, that they kind of did everything, and so we wouldn't want to criticize them for doing that. And yet, I think what we want to say is, but that still doesn't undo our anxieties or skepticism about this as a general practice. A, because of what Amit was saying, that like the fact that they did this well doesn't mean that everybody who follows that example would do it well. And also, Meta is an extremely specific business, right? Like there's very few, they're I think uniquely situated in a certain way where there's a sense to that. But not all businesses would be so situated or have that type of status or would be engaging in these sorts of services. So
I mean, there's a degree to which there's also as much as there might be all sorts of incentives. There exists actual incentives where they want people on their platforms, so they want to try to figure out ways to incorporate this into their thinking, right? And that maybe there might be less of a concern with kind of network effects, and this to the same degree for other companies, but there's plenty of other facets that's unique to the case.
It's interesting to think as a thought experiment, like what would be like a fast food company engaging their consumers' deliberative practice about what kind of food do they want, more salad or less salad, or more sugar or less sugar. And I can see why they would not have the incentive to do so, but it might be valuable to democracy. Other than that, if they provide information that would convince the consumers that no sugar is better, so it depends on what information, what experts and stuff like that.
That's great. Yeah, that's a good point. And I was just going to add, I mean, there is something very interesting. Part of what they were doing too is they expanded over time. They used these like processes to figure out what they wanted to do. And so one of the unique things is they were doing kind of international and seeing different perspectives across countries in ways that like, yeah, like actually as a social scientist, it's interesting to have that information about like these big technological questions and treating the fact that these questions are not just like national policy concerns, but are impacting the entire world. That's like a pretty kind of, it's also, I think, gets to, things that we're interested as democratic theorists in terms of thinking about, transnational political concerns and the modern world.
So, and actually revising my previous point, one of the differences between the Facebook case and the fast food companies that for fast food companies, there's established expertise about what is healthy and what is not healthy, right? The questions of whether you should have romantic relationship with your AI bot is um, there's no relevant expertise, and it's a question that no one knows. Like,
It's a very open question, very like new moment. And it's fascinating. Well, you both have been very generous with your time, so I really appreciate that. And before we go, but again, not just adding to those questions, but is there anything we didn't get a chance to talk about that you wanted to share? Any work that you wanted to, talk about that's coming up for you? Anything like that?
So actually, Amit, I'm not even sure if I told you about this, but I've been working. I'm working on this project with my friend and colleague and former Virtual Sentiments guest, Jennifer Forrestal, looking at the oversight board and cases in the oversight board. And we're doing it, so there's things about that, and I don't want to give away the ending, but the big sort of question is whether the Supreme Court or the sort of national judiciary is the right metaphor for thinking about what the oversight board is, and we're sort of looking at other weirder juridical examples as perhaps better metaphors or better analogies for thinking about the oversight board.
Awesome. I'm excited for that. Yeah, you did, and yeah. Maybe we'll have a sequel with you and Jennifer. How about Amit? Was there anything you wanted to share?
even I are working on thinking about what democracy means at what we call meso level institutions, like what democracy means in uh, schools, businesses, hospitals, universities, and the idea is to kind of collect insights from different sides of local democracies to think about the meaning of democracy in these contexts.
That's awesome. That sounds like a really great project too. Another great part two to have. Great. Well, I really do appreciate you guys joining us. Thank you so much. I learned so much, and I think this will be a great episode to share. Yeah. Thanks again.
Thanks, Kirsten.
Thank you. It was great.
I really loved how Amit described everybody's business. He and Abe wrote this book not just for business executives, but for citizens to think about what standards they hold businesses to. Abe and Amit argue that within liberal democracies, businesses should have a commitment to democracy. And this means not just what we might think of democracy as formal institutions like competitive elections or a representative Congress, but also practices that enable experimentation and reflexivity. Or to be specific here, the abilities of all members of the society to assess, monitor, evaluate, and revise democracy itself. By bringing democracy into the conversation of business ethics, Amit and Abe help us think about what kinds of practices are responsible or irresponsible for businesses to pursue, given their unique features and the ways that they are constituted, the strengths and weaknesses that they have when it comes to decision making and action. So, for example, we talked about how co founder and former CEO of Uber, Travis Kalanick, sometimes referred to the tradition of civil disobedience to justify Uber's flouting of local laws, and in fact, focus on areas where there were laws that they wanted to fight. Drawing on the philosophies of civil disobedience argued by thinkers like John Rawls and Martin Luther King Jr., Amit and Abe argued that businesses are not well situated to pursue civil disobedience. Any kind of lawbreaking like this should be very aberrational and exceptional as a result. We talked about this a little bit, but I want to draw on other arguments that they have in this book, and I highly recommend it. As they put in the book, this is because businesses are constituted in such a way that their incentives make them more likely for them to engage in motivated reasoning and a rationalization for breaking the law, not just as a way of rectifying public injustice, but in the pursuit of personal benefits. Amit and Abe argue that King's theory of civil disobedience has a strong emphasis on making sure that if you are breaking the law, it's for the sake of rectifying public injustice, not for benefiting from the action yourself. Additionally, as Amit and Abe emphasize in their book, civil disobedience is generally justified as a tool for those who are very much collectively disempowered, who have very few existing legal channels for change and recompense. Alternatively, in the kind of modern, developed liberal democracies that Amit and Abe are focused on, businesses generally have very strong capacities through legal infrastructure to not only achieve their collective goals, but even influence policies and seek legal adjudication. This brings us to one of the problems that they identify that businesses might engage in that undermine democracy, and that is what they call duplicitous exclusion via lobbying practices. So they even argue that some lobbying might be acceptable depending on the perspectives of the democratic community. But lobbying is worrisome when it engages in duplicitous exclusion. This is when businesses lead people to believe that certain individuals and groups have been included in lobbying and decision-making processes, but in fact, they have been excluded. And this can undermine overall trust in the integrity of the political process. This is what they call in their book representational corruption. They also criticize epistemic corruption, when businesses withhold information that is relevant to public discussion, which prevents citizens from being on the same playing field as lobbying businesses in terms of being able to assess and engage in democratic debate and decision making. So, if duplicitous exclusion is a problem, then what do we hope to see from businesses using Abe and Amit's framework? It's important to note that there can still be certain protections for businesses, like proprietary protections and privacy, when it comes to what Abe and Amit talk about as first order questions. So, specific immediate technologies that the companies develop that they might want to protect from their competitors, it's fair to expect some privacy. But insofar as the company is involved in policies and decision making that end up impacting public debate, just as an example, or the ability of social movements to organize, we should expect them to and hold them to standards of transparency and public justification for their actions. Again, and this is, to be clear, distinct from the idea of there being laws, but more about how should we as citizens judge businesses. And so we can use that idea to help us look back at the conversations we had this season on Meta's community forums, which are processes attempting to get feedback from people not only in the US, but around the world in order to shape policymaking at the company and providing this information to the public at large. I really love that I got to get Amit and Abe's perspectives on these policies. And they had a lot of positivity about Meta's specific projects and community forums. They highlighted, for example, that Meta did exactly what you would want a company to do, which is to work with third-party partners, such as the Deliberative Democracy Lab at Stanford. This insulated the processes from being more easily manipulated by the company itself to serve their own interests. And then in that way, gave a level of trust to the process for not only the participants involved, but for the rest of us who are reading about these reports online. However, they also pointed out that Meta might be quite uniquely situated to pursue the types of community forums that they set up. This is partly because of the nature of their work. They are dealing with ethical and political issues within their products and services that are ripe for public debate, that you want to get various perspectives on from users because there are no clear established facts. Whereas something like a fast food company, as Abe brought up, has to reckon with the fact that there is clear science, clear evidence about what kind of food is healthy and what kind of food isn't. This is a very different type of issue than the more subjective and contested issues around things like, what kind of tone, what kind of language should LLMs use when interacting with people? We also talked about how even though the particular example of community forums helmed by Meta, the Behavioral Insights team, and Stanford's Deliberative Democracy Lab were quite admirable and quite well run, you could imagine the same processes being helmed by a totally different company in a less trustworthy manner. So you could imagine that if they worked with a different institution, a company might more easily manipulate the deliberation process, creating the image of a legitimate, democratic process. And instead, manipulating the outcome either through the questions that were asked, the information that was provided to participants in the process, the moderation of the deliberation in the moment, and the release of results to the public. Working with third parties, and especially reliable established third parties, really helps prevent the possibilities of manipulation by the company itself and makes the process more trustworthy to the rest of the public, as well as the participants themselves. Thank you so much to Abe and Amit for this excellent conversation. And that is a wrap on our third season of Virtual Sentiments. I want to take the time to thank all of our guests this season, as well as Melody Hanson, my wonderful producer, who makes this sound so nice for all of you to listen to. And I want to thank you for listening. I hope you'll join us for our next season. Till next time.